Eric, it's great to catch up with you today. You helped me prepare for my PhD program with your stats class. So I'm grateful to you for your class and grateful that you'd be on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
And Eric, as you think back on your research, are there any simple, practical, underappreciated lessons you've learned that you'd most like to pass along to others?
It was an interesting question when you asked this because, you asked this in the email and kind of suggested this might be the prompt. And it made me really kind of go through and scour my research, right? Because the first tendency is to look at my research and say, okay, here's a lesson that we might be able to apply. But sometimes the biggest lessons and some of the underappreciated lessons have been the experience with not just one research project, but kind of a chain of research projects. And in particular, the lesson I was thinking about sharing was something about, kind of learning to be wrong. And what I mean by that is we write these papers and we do as careful of research as we possibly can. But then we have to recognize that when we do that, we're in a setting and we identify a relationship, and then we start to explore that relationship. And then the next time that somebody comes around, the setting might have changed, or perhaps we just kind of got lucky the first time. And so sometimes we go and we discover these great lessons and we get so excited and we become the spokesperson for these lessons. And then when we go on the other side of it is we find that maybe we weren't exactly right. And how do we start to kind of understand that as we go? And I don't know if it works, but I thought to kind of share a very simple example of it from early in my career, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. Love to hear it.
Well, so one of the very first topics I did was I did this work on college remediation with Bridget Long at Harvard. And one of the things that's great about kind of working with somebody else, especially somebody who kind of comes from a different background, is you have this wide open picture, and we really kind of prided ourselves in really being circumspect about what we were doing. And as we were working on college remediation and trying to understand students' experience, the impact of it, and so forth, we came to the conclusion that it was really hurting some students, and we came out very strongly. And so then we do what you're supposed to do when you have it. We went on the touring circuit and went and told everybody, oh, college remediation is awful. It's not working. It's got all these problems. And I remember being in a meeting and, one of the presidents of a university got up there and just started yelling at me that I was wrong and everything. But of course, as a good academic, I dug in. I was so, yes, we're right here. And then we got another year of data. And that extra year of data changed the story. Turns out that, yes, after 4 years, they weren't doing as well as the others. But after the fifth year, they caught up.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the hard part then is, what do you do, right? And here's the lesson, right? Is like, do you go and say, well, no, it's wrong, it's just bad? Or do you try to give a broader picture, and do you go and tell people, yeah, I spoke too early? And so I decided, to kind of tell the story that the data told. The data told the story. After 4 years, things weren't quite as good. After 5 years, they were good, and started going back and revising that story and going back to some of these same audiences where I just told them it was bad, telling them, well, now we have extra data, and trying to kind of, repent, so to speak, of all the lessons that I told them. But I think the lesson here that I had was, and I'm glad it happened early in my career, was a lot of academics, kind of dig in, they learn something, and they kind of put in their mind, okay, this is how the world is. And even in, the way that we try to learn things, the whole nature of statistics is sometimes we're wrong. And learning how to accept and recognize when we're wrong is actually a good thing. It's a very good thing, and it's a very hard thing. And it's not just that lesson applies to, getting an academic paper and finding that the findings are different as time goes on, but it also applies to, subsequent projects. So when I've looked at other forms of remediation, I get different answers, and trying to understand why I get different answers and whether there really is a definitive answer out there. But the important part, is trying to recognize that all of the efforts that we try to make, not just in my professional side, but also in my other parts of my life, we're always just trying to learn. And as we learn, we get some things right, we get some things wrong. And that ability for us to step back every once in a while and say, maybe I didn't get that right, but let's try to do it again and see if I get a different answer. And trying to do that is something that I think is a good lesson for life. I think learning that lesson in my academic careers, learning to do that in my marriage is also kind of a good thing, to recognize that every once in a while when I've dug into something, I might be wrong and I really need to go back and fix that. And so that's kind of the place where one way that I learned that lesson.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting lesson, Eric. One of the most valuable lessons I've learned from doing a PhD is to see how often I'm wrong, because you make predictions, you're certain you're going to get a result. I run experiments, and then I collect the data and I look at the data, and again, I'm certain I'm going to get the results. And then it's just amazing how often the results don't, the data doesn't say what you thought it was going to say. And sometimes not only does it not say what you thought it was going to say, it's the complete opposite, and you get the opposite result. And I just feel like that's one of the most valuable lessons I've learned, that I'm not as smart as I think I am. The world's oftentimes not as predictable as we think it is. And it has hopefully taught me just to be more humble and to follow the data. And in your case, this is a really, the research you're doing impacts students and their well-being. I mean, you talk about this remediation. I mean, I imagine universities, colleges all across the country they're trying to take into account this research. Do we offer college remediation or not?
And one of the things that's interesting is it actually winds up being, that series of papers, one of the most cited works that I've ever done. So people really looked at it. People were very interested in kind of the lessons that were to be learned there. And then to kind of step back and be the person in the room who says, if the next paper comes out and builds on it. I mean, one of the things I think that's underappreciated in academics is oftentimes the value of a paper is, and I would say also for life, not just academics, is being able to ask the question. And then you get your answer, and then you kind of have to step back and ask yourself, and continually ask yourself, have I got it right? And as you continue to try to, study it, experiment with it, do whatever it is, you start to kind of recognize whether you are really onto something that's consistently giving you the same answer. And then starting to work on that knowledge, but always being humble enough to step back and say, and one of the things that was a byproduct of that paper, it was one of the very first papers to take a rigorous look at remediation. I think part of the reason why it's so cited is because now it has spurred hundreds of people to do research in this area, and they keep citing it as kind of the first paper in this area. But now the research is so far beyond the things that I was doing. They've run experiments in the field, they've tried different modalities of doing it, they've tried all these new things. And so, on the one hand, I was kind of bummed when we were not really kind of getting and converging on a single solution. But now when I look at the whole body of it, and I see that because we asked the question, and somebody else might have asked it, was probably going to ask it at some point, but because we started asking the questions, other people started looking into it, and then a group was looking into it, and then many people were trying to figure out how to fix it, and it confirmed some parts of what we looked at and disproved other parts, but also presented new solutions. And so I think, where we're at today in college, I've been saying remediation, but I think the right title is developmental learning. Where we are right now in developmental studies is a much better place as a result of the body of research that happened there. And so sometimes asking the question doesn't necessarily mean that we put ourselves into a box. What it does is helps us to start to frame that question in a broader place and help others start to grapple with the same questions that we have.
And that just made me think, what is the state of developmental learning or college remediation, and what does that look like? I mean, we're using these terms, but some people may not know or have gone through a program. So what does that look like, and what is the state of it now in universities and colleges?
Well, just to give you a quick idea, I mean, so what oftentimes, especially in non-selective colleges, the real gatekeeper isn't admissions, because they're open admissions. It's whether or not you can pass a placement exam that demonstrates that you have a proficiency in math as well as in language. And it's a real surprise to some students when they take these placement exams. And there's some research now that's out there that suggests even the placement exams aren't overly predictive of kind of success. But if you fail that exam, then you're stuck in the typical program. in some type of developmental education. And before you can move on in math and language, you have to actually do some type of developmental education to try to shore up those things. Now, what's the innovation that I think I'm probably most excited about? There's a group at RAND and UT Dallas who've done some randomized control trials in Texas, where what they did was they actually embedded in the assignments that students were getting in the first class in their major a set of assignments that actually required the math skills that they would have developed in the other one. And so what they did on the side while they're in their first class in their major was they taught them these extra skills. And in the process of them doing general education classes, they added these modules that would allow them to learn these skills in the context of subjects they wanted to study. And so they developed these skills, and in this kind of, they sometimes call it like a concurrent enrollment. They've been able to develop those skills while not being set back. And historically, you couldn't take those classes until you'd pass these developmental classes. And now by teaching them side by side, they're more interesting, and we're seeing more success and students more likely to go on. So, it's a great state of where the people are at. I wish I'd discovered all of that stuff, but I'm glad that I could be part of that learning process.
Yeah, really cool to hear. I mean, there are very few places in the world that can improve hopefully your mind and your intellect and your thinking ability and your job opportunities and just all opportunities in life. As a university can. Cool to hear about some of the innovations that are happening there. As we wrap up, is there any other final lesson that you'd like to share in the last few minutes here?
Well, maybe just to build on this one just a little bit more, one of the things that I find is that when you have expertise in something, or when people perceive you do, you're often asked to comment on things, to come in and to talk to people about the types of things you've learned and to give those lessons. And so one of the things that I found in that setting is coming in that same notion of humility and recognizing that oftentimes people who are experiencing it, people who are going through it, have more information or different information than you might have as you're trying to evaluate things. And as you can see it from their perspective, and if you're humble and present yourself not as the expert in the room, but as a person who's fighting side by side with them to make it better, I find that I get kind of greater cooperation and greater capacity to be involved in the decision making when I approach things with that same type of attitude of, I know I might be wrong, but here's what we know. Here's the pluses, here's the minuses, but we need to figure out for your situation. And so as part of it is, it's not just being willing to be humble in the way that we learn things and in the lessons we learn and be teachable as we go through things, but there's this extra layer that we also, in our leadership opportunities and in our ability, in our opportunities to really change the world, approaching it with a level of humility so that the other people on the other side of the table feel empowered to make the types of decisions and to ask the kinds of questions that they need to ask to really understand whether it works in their settings. It makes for wonderful partnerships. And as I've gone, through different state governments or to different, countries and worked with the leaders in those areas on educational policy, when I've approached it with that kind of humble attitude of let's learn together, we can form partnerships that last for decades because people are excited. People see that I care about what they're doing. And then we can also discover things together and ask questions that I probably wouldn't have been able to ask if I had actually approached it in a more rigid way. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but hopefully it does.
Yeah, really interesting. I think one way to think about this is you're talking about humility when we learn, and then humility when we share. And
Yeah.
I heard a lesson just a couple weeks ago that said your job as a teacher is to help people ride a bike. I can stand up here and I can tell you what it feels like to ride a bike, and I can try and describe it, and I can talk to you about balance and motion and pedaling. But until you actually get on a bike, you just don't understand what it's like. And I really like that analogy. My job as a teacher, when I'm sharing things that I want people to learn, is to help them get on the bike, and then we ride together, and having some humility with, I'm not just going to stand up and tell you everything. We're going to do this together. It's cool to hear that lesson, that it's been much more effective for you. And this is something that I want to remember as I teach a lot, both in the classroom and try to share things on this podcast to just have a mindset of humility.
I think that's right. And then the more that you have that and the more you approach situations, you build the capacity in other people for them to be able to make those types of decisions and for them to be able to get on the bike and then not only figure out how to do the bike, but how to share those lessons with other people as they learn how not just to ride the bike, but to do real tricks on the bike that I never thought were possible.
Well, it's so cool to hear these lessons. I mean, I know you're working, like you said, state governments and federal governments and other countries, and your work has an impact, and people are making decisions that affect the lives of, I don't know, thousands, hundreds of thousands, uh, maybe even millions, and depending on how long this world lasts, we'll see as you just contribute piece by piece, a little bit here, a little bit there to this body of knowledge, and allows other researchers to come and build on top of you. So anyway, I just want to thank you, Eric, for coming on. It's so great to catch up again, and appreciate you sharing these lessons with me.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. Great talking to you today.